I was sprinting down the corridor, phone clamped to my ear, whispering and shouting at once as I told the neighbor exactly where to find the pills. Bathroom cabinet, third shelf, white bottle behind the vitamins, not the blue one, not the penicillin. I could hear my abuela coughing in the background, the neighbor's voice breaking up with every word, and the paramedics on the line asked questions that came out in English I couldn't translate fast enough if I didn't cut through the panic. No, no, que no si penicillina, I said, and then in English. It's the white bottle behind the vitamins, third shelf, bathroom. My hands were shaking so much the phone slipped against my ear, and I kept moving because distance felt dangerous and every second counted. Tell them to hurry, the neighbor cried into my ear, and I barked back, they're already on their way. Tell them she is allergic to penicillin, no penicillin, she can't have it, you'll kill her. I was switching languages so quickly my words blurred together, Spanish then English then Spanish, mixing like a split screen in my head. The paramedics didn't understand Spanish. I became the bridge and I felt that weight pound in my chest with every step. I could see the bathroom door from 3 classrooms away, the fluorescent lights cutting the hallway into pieces, and I moved like I had to carry time in my hands. As I passed the main entrance I saw him, Principal Ryan Walker, standing near the front glass doors holding up his phone. I felt my breath snag. He was filming me while I was telling someone how to save a life. He didn't shout, didn't run, didn't help, he filmed. I wanted to grab him to yell, help me please, but the phone at my ear kept me tied to the neighbor and the paramedics. He's recording, I said into the phone, voice low and hot, and the neighbor asked, why would he? There was no time for answers. I shouted the last directions as I pushed open the bathroom door. The smell of bleach hit me and I saw my abuela on the floor slumped in a chair, face white, hands trembling. I dropped to my knees and started naming the bottles, pulling my mother's old prescription cleaner like a ritual. Acqui, acqui, I said, holding up the white bottle so the neighbor could see through the camera on my phone. The paramedics arrived seconds later, pounding down the hallway, machines beeping, voices clipped and professional. And they moved like people who'd practiced life-saving more than they'd practiced empathy. Thank God, one of them said in English. I translated everything they asked, the dosage, the allergies, when she last took anything. I told them which pills she hadn't taken, which ones she had, and why penicillin was the one to avoid. They listened, then asked me to step back. I remember stepping back and watching the paramedic take the bottle from my hand and nod, then talk to his partner, then to the neighbor. I remember the neighbor saying, she saved her, and something in my chest folding and releasing. Abuela's color came back slowly, not all at once, like a bruise fading. I sat on the floor and cried into my hands because I had been so sure I had lost her. Later that day, word moved faster than I could. A video of me in the hallway, Principal Walker filming, upright and composed, started making rounds in person and online. Someone had uploaded it and people began to write their own stories around what they'd seen in a clip that didn't say what had actually happened. I was doing the only thing I could do, translating across panic, and other people decided to make it a show. I got called reckless, a rule breaker, and accused of staging a scene to provoke the school. I sat in the office where administrators repeated policy like a prayer and handed me a pre-filled suspension form. Emergencies don't override school policy, Principal Walker said to me in a tone that refused to have feeling. The same man who filmed the moment didn't seem to understand why that mattered. They told me I had broken the rule of speaking a language other than English on campus. They said it was simple, black and white, a policy they had enforced for 2 years with automatic suspensions and notes to records. I thought of all the times I'd learned to sleep with my phone off so teachers wouldn't hear my Spanish, of coded taps in bathroom stalls to tell my mom what was wrong, of holding my breath at school functions when parents were laughed at for their accents. In those moments, the policy felt less like order and more like a blade aimed to silence people like me and my family. The administrators said the hearing would be in English only and that the security footage with audio would be internal evidence I couldn't access. They tried to turn the thing I did to save a life into a technicality. I looked at the suspension form and then at the hallway where I'd run, at the broken light by the third locker, at the scrape on the floor from where my shoe had caught, and I knew I wouldn't sign anything that made me vanish. I walked out of the office, and every step back to class felt like walking through mud, the world suddenly watching me in a way that didn't match what I'd actually done. The next morning, he put that hallway clip up on the projector like it was some kind of evidence show and slid a pre-filled suspension form across my desk while the classroom smelled like chalk and cheap coffee. I remember the projector light cutting across my face and the silence that followed the clip. No one scrambled to explain what really happened. No one asked if my abuela was okay. He didn't look angry like someone who thought a kid had done something harmful. He looked clinical, like he was measuring a rule's effectiveness. Emergencies don't override school policy, Principal Ryan Walker said, and the room leaned into that sentence like it was gospel. He read from the policy sheet as if it left no room for context, and I felt that paper like a cold thing pressed to my chest. Any language other than English on school property is prohibited, he told the room, then slid the prefilled suspension form toward me the way you slide a bill across a counter. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my face steady because I knew every second of hesitation would be the thing they framed as guilt. People around me shifted in their seats, some looked down, some watched the paper like it was the weather. My teacher, who always had kind eyes, didn't move. No one moved. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. He said the rule had been enforced for 2 years and then listed off the consequences like a script. Automatic suspensions, notes to permanent records, teachers expected to police bathrooms and hallways. He made it sound routine, like a school safety drill, but I remembered names and faces. I thought of the Filipino kid in my English class who stopped talking about his lunchbox recipe because a teacher laughed at his accent. I thought of the girl from the Vietnamese family who stopped coming to parent nights because staff mocked her father's broken English. I thought of the Haitian students who were watched during dismissal like they might smuggle another language onto campus. I thought of a Puerto Rican mother who was told to speak properly when she came to sign permission slips, and she left with tears on her cheeks. "Why would you film me?" I asked Principal Al Walker, and my voice sounded thin to my own ears. He tapped the phone screen, a small impersonal motion, and told me he had a right to document campus behavior. "Policy is clear," he said. "We have to enforce it consistently." Consistently, he said, as if enforcement were a neutral action and not a culture of silence that fell heavy on certain kids. The words wrapped around me in a way I couldn't push off. I wanted to scream, to tell every single person that I had been saving my abuela's life that morning, not doing some performance for views or attention. Would it matter if I had been translating for my mother at home? I asked, because the absurdity kept burning in my throat. Would it matter if this were a medical emergency? He didn't answer the question I asked. Instead, he pointed to the form and told me that I could either accept the in-school suspension or go to a disciplinary hearing. It felt like a joke with bad timing. My friends in the room stared at me like the choice was mine to make in some abstract, detached way. Word of the clip spread fast. Some students whispered she staged it. Others said she broke the rule. Someone posted the video with a caption that twisted the whole thing into a political stunt. It was strange to have strangers read a small clip and decide the whole story. Nobody had seen me on the phone translating, nobody had heard the coughing or the neighbor's panic. All anyone saw was a kid speaking Spanish in a hallway. That was the part people wanted to make the headline. After class, the counselor, an earnest man named Orlando Hale, pulled me into his office and closed the door like we were trying to keep a secret from the rest of the building. He'd helped before, quietly, when teachers threatened detention for small things. "We're going to find out what we can do," he told me. "This isn't right." He gave me time to breathe and then started asking practical questions. Who called the paramedics, whether there was an ER note, who could verify my account. I told him the neighbor had been hysterical and that I had the paramedics' belief that my translation mattered. He nodded and scribbled notes, and for the first time that day, one adult didn't sound like a judge. But other adults didn't help. An assistant principal told my mother over the phone that school policy had to be upheld and that they couldn't make exceptions. She worked long shifts at a distribution center and held the phone like it was a contract she couldn't refuse. I could hear the frustration in her voice and the way she had to hold back tears because taking more time off meant losing pay. I felt trapped between a school that wanted my silence and a home that needed me to speak. My abuela's condition didn't care about policy sheets or social media clips. It cared about the bottle that could kill her if given by mistake. I refused to sign the form that day. I couldn't sign something that made my act of saving a life look like a rule violation without explanation. They said that would make things worse, that refusing was its own show of defiance. But the thought of erasing the reason I had run, of making my abuela invisible in a paper trail, felt worse than any punishment. I kept thinking about the kids who had stopped speaking their languages because of fear. If I signed away my right to explain, what did that look like for them? What did that teach the teachers who policed us? What did it teach the parents they made leave in shame? I walked out of the office with the paper still blank, and every step felt like a decision that would echo louder than the classroom projector. For 2 years, I learned how to live quiet at school so I wouldn't get in trouble, and I practiced those small tricks until they felt like armor. I answered my abuela's calls at lunch with nothing but "hmm" and "no" because a full conversation might be heard, and I tapped codes in bathroom stalls, 3 taps for take medicine, 4 taps for call mom, so my mom would know without anyone else hearing. I learned to text medicine names when callers could read a screen, leaving out whole sentences and relying on shorthand to get a point across. It was ugly and clever at once, and it worked most of the time until it didn't. My mom worked a 45-minute drive away at the distribution center, and she couldn't just drop everything if a crisis happened. She would take days off when she could, but not always. That made me the emergency contact, the person who had to know the names of pills and doctors and times and dosages so my family would be safe. I kept a notebook of numbers and allergy notes tucked in my locker under a stack of textbooks because I was trying to be practical in a place that punished practicality. I was the one who learned to carry the weight of both homes, one that spoke Spanish in calm and one that spoke the school's rules in a flat voice. The morning my abuela collapsed, there was no room for any of those quiet tricks. A neighbor called screaming that abuela had fallen and couldn't stand up. The voice on the other end of the line kept mixing up medicine names because she was crying and English wasn't her first language either. The paramedics were on the line but they didn't speak Spanish and my mom couldn't get there fast. I had to choose between obeying a school rule and failing to do nothing while someone I loved could die. There was no clever workaround. I grabbed my phone and ran. "She's allergic to penicillin," I said, snapping from Spanish to English for the paramedics and back to Spanish to the neighbor, and repeating the dosage names until someone on the other end of the call understood. I remember listing where the bottles were. Bathroom cabinet, third shelf, white bottle behind the vitamins, not the blue one. I felt like I was naming parts of a map and handing it to someone who couldn't see. Every second stretched thin, and my lungs burned with the kind of breath that comes when you know the stakes. When the paramedics arrived, I kept translating even as they pushed past me. "No penicillin, allergic she had," I said in Spanish and then in English, and the paramedic looked at me like I was both the problem and the solution. He asked when she last took anything and I told him dos horas and then 2 hours ago because he asked in English and the neighbor needed it in Spanish. I watched as they checked her and I watched my abuela's chest lift slow and steady like someone rebooting a machine. That night she didn't feel like a statistic. She felt like a person who had been returned to us by a string of words I spat out without thinking. Afterwards, when people wanted to turn the story into a clip, they edited out everything that didn't fit their narrative. The video left a little square of me speaking Spanish in a hallway and nothing of the phone at my ear translating paramedic questions or the neighbors sobbing in the background. No one in that clip heard my abuela cough or saw the white bottle on the shelf. They couldn't see that my words had been what kept her alive. It was hard to understand how a moment of urgency could become a rule violation to someone who hadn't been there. I thought about all the other times the rule had bitten people. I remembered a friend from Filipino background who stopped bringing his food from home because someone in the cafeteria made him feel small about his lunch. I remembered a Vietnamese family who stopped coming to meetings after a counselor commented on their accent. I thought about how our school treated language like a uniform we were expected to swap into and out of depending on who watched. But that morning, language wasn't a uniform, it was a lifeline and I had to use it. People started to say I had broken the rule on purpose, like I held up my abuela's health as a banner. That thought nearly made my stomach drop every time I heard it, like I had to prove I hadn't used my grandmother's life for attention. I couldn't understand how someone could watch the clip and not ask what had happened off camera. I couldn't understand how saving a life could be reframed as breaking a rule. None of it fit together except how neat it looked on a policy sheet. At home later that day, my abuela grabbed my hand and said in Spanish, "Hija, you did right." She said it softly, and I felt as if someone had finally said out loud the part I already knew. My mom came home exhausted from work and wrapped her arms around us both and cried a little because she was tired and scared and mad. I told them both what happened at school about the form and the rule and the clip, and they listened like people who knew the world could be cruel in small, legal ways. We didn't have answers, but we had each other, and for a while that felt like the thing that mattered most. They walked me down the tile hallway to the admin office like I was a problem to be managed, not a kid who had just saved her grandmother. They handed me a packet of papers with my name on top and told me the disciplinary hearing would be conducted in English only. I read the line out loud because it felt like proof that this was happening. All proceedings will be in English. I asked if an interpreter could be provided, and they looked at me as if I had asked for something impossible. "This is school policy," one administrator said, and slid the packet back across the desk like the answer was final. They told me the security footage was internal evidence I couldn't access and that I would have to accept whatever they presented. I felt like the room had tilted. "You can't show me the video of the thing I'm supposed to defend myself from?" I asked, because it didn't make sense to me that the proof against me was a private thing. They said the footage would be reviewed and considered by the hearing panel, but I wouldn't get to see the audio or the raw file. I imagined frames of me running past the lockers, my chest heaving, my voice half Spanish, half English, and I felt anger like heat in my hands. Word spread faster than I could manage. Rumors bloomed online and in group chats like a wildfire started from one careless spark. Someone posted the clip with a caption that said I staged the incident. Someone else wrote that I had acted out to make a political point. I watched strangers argue over a few seconds of video that didn't show the neighbor on the phone or the paramedics knocking. My notifications filled up with messages from people who had never met my abuela and had already decided what kind of person I was. It felt unreal that my family's panic was being turned into content and commentary. Counselor Orlando Hale, he's the school counselor who has pulled kids into his office before to talk things out, came to see me and closed the door like a small island of quiet. He didn't read policy like some adults, he listened. "We'll get what we can," he said, and then he started writing down names, dates, and times. He told me to get an ER note and to find anyone who had heard the call or seen me run. He said, "Don't let them make your life into a clip." His steady voice was the first thing that didn't sound like judgment that day. I emailed a friend who worked in our neighborhood clinic and they gave me a copy of the ambulance report. I asked the neighbor to write a short note describing her call and she did it shaking, her writing uneven. I went to the hospital later and asked for a signed letter from the ER doctor that said translation helped avoid a bad reaction. Every piece of paper felt heavy and small at once, like each one was a counterweight to the school's official story. I kept thinking about the security footage they wouldn't show me and how the little details, my Spanish, the phone pressed to my ear, the neighbor's voice, mattered more than anyone who had only seen the clip could know. A legal aid lawyer named Ruben Ortiz, he called himself a volunteer who worked with students, met with me and explained things in plain terms. Title VI says programs that get federal money can't discriminate based on national origin, he told me, and then he added, language access matters under that rule. He told me the district should provide interpreters when a parent or student needs one for a disciplinary meeting, and that refusing an interpreter could be a problem if it blocks someone from getting a fair hearing. Hearing that made part of me breathe easier because legal words suddenly lined up with what I already knew in my bones. The rule wasn't just unfair, it might be against the law. Still, the district initially refused to provide an interpreter for the hearing. They told me they'd only accommodate if a formal request came in writing from a parent and if there was enough lead time. My mom worked a long shift and couldn't always drop everything to get paperwork signed. The assistant principal suggested I accept the in-school suspension just to make the issue go away. "It'll be easier for you," she said. It sounded like mercy from someone who had never had to translate the word allergic in the middle of a panic. I felt cornered between the clock of hospital shifts, the slow gears of the legal system, and the school's insistence that English was the only language that belonged in that building. I kept thinking about my abuela's hand gripping mine in the hospital, and about how small those hospital walls had felt when the world outside wanted to call my actions a rule-breaking stunt. I started building a stack of proof because words alone weren't going to be enough against a policy and a video that left out half the story, and I knew paper could sometimes make adults listen. The first thing I got was a signed letter from the ER doctor, the one who'd seen my abuela that morning. He wrote in plain language that without someone translating, a dangerous medication could have been given by mistake, and he said my translation likely prevented a fatal reaction. Holding that page felt like holding a small lifeline. It was hard to argue with a doctor's note. I pulled together timestamps from my phone call logs and the ambulance report to show exactly when the neighbor called, when I ran down the hall, and when the paramedics arrived. Those numbers lined up like train schedules and they made the timeline hard to argue with. I also had the neighbor write a short statement about what she heard on the phone and how she couldn't explain the medication names in English when she was crying. Her handwriting shook on the paper, and she wrote in Spanish and English so the hearing panel couldn't claim she didn't try to communicate. Next, I collected anonymous statements from other students whose lives had been clipped by this rule. They told stories about missing awards because a teacher said something in Tagalog in the hall, about parents who stopped coming to meetings after they were mocked, about families who felt watched in the parking lot at dismissal. Each of those notes read like the same cut, people shrinking their voices so they wouldn't be punished. I taped them together with my own timeline and the ER letter like a small, messy mosaic of what the rule did to real people. Those voices were enough to show the rule wasn't abstract. It was hurting people in ways the administration pretended not to see. I also managed to get a forwarded video that showed Principal Walker holding up his phone and filming me as I ran by. The clip itself didn't show the phone call or the neighbor or the paramedics, but it did show him with his arm up, his phone pointed, the small motion of a man who chose to record instead of help. That frame made everything colder. Someone trusted to run a school decided documentation mattered more than a broken body on the floor. I printed that still and put it with the other papers, because it mattered who had power in that hall and what they decided to do with it. When I brought the packet to the assistant principal, she didn't look like she was surprised by anything I had. She leafed through the documents as if they were another homework packet, and then she pushed a paper across the desk like she had a trade to offer. She said, "We can keep this quiet, take a detention, sign this form, and we won't escalate it further." Her voice was low and practiced, the tone someone uses when they want compliance more than conversation. The deal was essentially, accept a small punishment now, stay silent, and the official record won't reflect the real fight. It was an attempt to bury the issue. I remember the paper felt thin and wrong in my hands. Signing it would mean saying I agreed to hide what had happened and to let the rule keep doing damage. It would mean other kids could be punished for the same thing without anyone speaking up. It would mean my abuela's near-death got used to make a rule easier to keep. I looked at the assistant principal and said, "I can't sign that, I won't sign that." My voice felt firmer than I expected, and she blinked like she hadn't heard that answer before. She warned me there would be consequences if I pressed the complaint, the full suspension, a hearing that would be rough, maybe more trouble for college. She framed it like a choice that only I had to shoulder and like she was offering mercy. But what she called mercy sounded like a bribe to keep students quiet and families scared. I thought about the Filipino kid who stopped singing in the chorus because a teacher laughed, about the Haitian families who were shamed in front of the office, and about the Puerto Rican mother who didn't come back after being told to speak properly. My refusal wasn't just about me. It was about not letting school policy decide which lives were allowed to make noise. I started reaching out to the community lawyer Ruben had suggested, and Orlando helped me collect more school memos and emails where staff had been told to enforce the rule. We assembled everything into a binder and made copies for the district and the free legal clinic. I felt nervous handing those copies to other adults, like a kid showing that the emperor had no clothes. Still, there was a small, steady part of me that felt right about refusing the quiet. If my abuela's life had to be a lesson, then it should teach something bigger than compliance. If the school wanted to punish me for speaking in a life-or-death moment, they would have to explain themselves publicly. I wasn't willing to let them hide behind forms and quiet deals. The hearing room smelled like old coffee and paper. I sat at the long table with my binder in front of me, the hospital letter folded on top so it wouldn't slide. Orlando sat to my left, quiet and steady, and Ruben, the legal aid lawyer, sat to my right, flipping through copies. Principal Ryan Walker sat across from me with a stack of his own papers and a face that had practiced being neutral for a long time. The district representative sat behind him, reading slowly as if the words were heavy stones. I felt my heart in my throat, but I kept my hands steady because my words had to be clear. They started with the clip Principal Walker had shown in class. He watched the screen like it proved everything, like a few seconds could tell why I should be disciplined. "Policy is policy," he said when it was his turn. "Exceptions undermine consistent enforcement." His voice was calm and flat, the kind of voice that makes rules sound like facts. I wanted to tell him that policy is not neutral when it targets some people more than others. But I had to stick to the papers and the timeline we had put together. I pushed the ER letter forward and said, "This is from the doctor who treated my abuela. He says my translation prevented a fatal medication error." Ruben translated some of my Spanish into legal terms and Orlando added the neighbor's written note. I handed out copies of the anonymous testimonies and watched faces change as adults read stories about families who had been humiliated or shut out. There were notes about awards lost and parents who stopped coming to school events. The room got quieter as those pages moved around the table, like a physical weight they couldn't deny. The district representative read the documents slowly and then asked questions, the kind that felt like someone searching for a legal crack to wedge into. "Were there any other witnesses?" she asked. "Did the ambulance report mention language barriers?" I answered as best I could, and Ruben handed over the timestamps and the ambulance report which matched my phone logs. Orlando spoke up and said, "A policy that leaves no room for emergencies is a policy that harms students." And he looked at me like he believed it, like he had seen the faces of kids silenced by rules. Principal Walker repeated that exceptions could set precedents and that staff needed a clear line to follow. "If we allow language exceptions in one case, what's to stop students from claiming emergencies?" he asked with a tone like a principal, not a person. I wanted to say, if a kid needs to save a life, why would you make them choose between saving someone and their future? But instead I showed the ER letter again and the anonymous notes. and Ruben reminded the panel about Title VI and duties to provide language access when needed. After they left the room to decide, I sat with my binder and felt like someone waiting for a verdict in a trial that should never have been necessary. Orlando told me quietly, "You did what you had to no matter the outcome, you spoke for more than yourself." Ruben rubbed his forehead and said, "We made our record, if they don't act, we take it further." Those words steadied me in the small hollow of the waiting room. When they came back, the district representative spoke for the panel. They decided to reduce the proposed 3-day out-of-school suspension to 1 day in school. They would flag my record as under review instead of permanently marking it, and they would open a district inquiry into language access policies. The room felt both tighter and a little less heavy all at once. It wasn't the full clearing I wanted, but it was something. A formal acknowledgement that emergencies might need exceptions and that families deserve interpreters for meetings. I felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief because my abuela's life and my actions were recognized in writing, and anger because the punishment still stood and because the policy still existed. Someone said it was a compromise and the district called it a fair outcome. Principal Walker nodded like he had won a point by keeping the rules general force. I left with a 1-day in-school suspension to serve and a binder of copies to keep fighting with. Outside the building, I called my mom and my abuela and told them the result. My abuela squeezed my hand in the hospital and said, "You did the right thing," and my mom cried a little on the phone, relief and worry braided together. The panel's decision didn't clean everything up, it only made a small crack in the wall. It meant we could push more, that families could ask for interpreters, and that emergencies wouldn't be invisible anymore. But I knew the deeper work, teaching staff to stop policing language and changing the culture of silence, was still ahead of us. I had made a dent, and now I had to keep pushing until it stopped being enough to only dent a problem that affects so many lives. The 1-day in-school suspension felt like a punishment wrapped in fluorescent light. They put me in a small, windowless room with a stack of worksheets and a clock that ticked slow like it was rubbing salt into the day. I missed a chemistry lab where we were starting a new unit, and that lab grade dragged my overall score down. I sat at a desk with no lab partner, no teacher to explain the parts I missed, and I watched the class next door through a sliver of glass doing the exact work that would follow me on my transcript. When I came back to the hallway the next day, people looked at me differently. Friends who used to nod when I passed stopped making eye contact. Whispers trailed behind me like a tail I couldn't shake. Someone called me reckless in a group chat, and a second kid said I was a drama student trying to make a point. I kept hearing the edges of those comments even when the words weren't there, and it made school feel like 2 rooms separated by a glass wall, one where I existed, and one where everyone else assumed things I hadn't done. Teachers walked around with a new caution, like they didn't know how to treat the student who'd broke the rule. One science teacher folded his arms differently when I asked a question, like I might act out again. A counselor who used to sit with me in the mornings gave me a pat and then stayed a little more formal. It was small stuff, and some people were kind in private, but the public had a shape now and it wasn't mine anymore. Every day I checked my phone for updates on my scholarship, and every notification felt like a possible blow. Still, change happened in a way that mattered. The district later issued a limited emergency exception that said non-English could be used when a medical or safety situation required it. That rule didn't erase the 2 years we'd had of silence, but it meant the next kid in my place wouldn't have to choose between obeying a rule and saving someone. The district also put a policy in place to honor interpreter requests for parent meetings. That requirement was a lifeline for families who'd stopped showing up because they were mocked or shouted down in meetings they couldn't follow. I remember seeing the new policy memo online and feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and bitterness. The memo used bureaucratic language and careful phrases, but it finally said what we had been screaming for. Families had a right to be understood and emergencies were exceptions. It was not justice in the big sense, no apologies, no removal of the whole policy, but it was a crack. It opened a door for parents who needed an interpreter to speak in their own language without fear of punishment. After the decision, people started to email the school asking how to request an interpreter for meetings. A few teachers who had been zealous about enforcing the rule began to step back when a parent arrived and asked for help in Spanish or Creole. Some of that came from fear of getting called out by the district. Some came from seeing the human cost up close. I sat in on a community meeting where Ruben, the legal aid lawyer who helped me, explained how Title VI applied and what families could expect. Parents asked questions, some for the first time, and their voices, soft, deliberate, and sometimes raw, filled a room that had once felt closed. Even with the policy change, the echoes of being treated differently followed me through the halls for months after. Scholarship committees asked for explanations, some deferred decisions while they reviewed my file, and the delay cost me sleep and peace. I had to explain the hearing, and the suspension in forms and interviews like it was a resume item. Every time I wrote about what happened, I worried about how it sounded to people who hadn't lived that hallway, that phone call, that smell of hospital antiseptic. At home, my abuela recovered slowly with extra checks and a careful medicine schedule. My mom took fewer risks at work when she could, and we made a plan for emergencies that didn't rely on me being at school or on someone else catching a call. We printed lists, labeled bottles in big letters, and left a copy of my abuela's allergies where neighbors could see them. Those small steps made me feel less like a single translator and more like a family plugged into a system that could help. The one-day suspension sat on my record as a scar, but the policy change felt like a promise, small, negotiable, and fragile, but a promise nonetheless. It meant the district had to reckon with the idea that language is part of safety, not disorder. I didn't get everything I wanted, and I still carry the cost of math and chemistry points I lost that semester. But I helped make it safer for the next kid to answer their parents' call. That mattered in the quiet moments when I could breathe without my chest feeling like it needed to carry someone else's life all at once. Some days I still feel the sting of people assuming the worst from a clip that ignored the rest. Other days I feel the slow satisfaction of seeing a mom come into a conference room with a Spanish interpreter at her side, and the way she relaxes when she can say what she needs to say. Progress doesn't fix everything, but it gives a place to stand while you keep pushing, and standing there felt like the only honest thing I could do after the hallway and the phone and the white bottle behind the vitamins. In the weeks after the hearing, I kept working like I had a job no one paid me for, collecting anonymous statements from Vietnamese and Haitian classmates who had learned to flatten themselves because of the rule. I wrote emails, printed pages, and met friends in the library between classes to tape their words into a binder. "You can't put my name," one friend said, voice tight, and I said, "I won't." We folded paper around our stories like armor, and the pile grew heavy with things adults pretended not to notice. The missed awards, the parents who stopped coming, the kids who would rather be quiet than punished. I sat down and wrote an op-ed for the student paper about being half-voiced, the way I felt split between home and school, the way my Spanish lived in my mouth as the place of care and all the school wanted was a perfect English. I wrote plainly about that morning with my abuela and about how a simple policy had made me choose between a rule and a life. When the piece ran, other students started sending me messages. "Me too, they did that to my dad. Thanks for saying it out loud." Those short notes made the binder matter. It wasn't just paper anymore, it was a chorus. Ruben, the legal aid lawyer who'd come to our meetings, and Orlando, the counselor who had kept a door open for me, helped push the community meetings where parents and students could talk safely. Ruben explained how Title VI might apply if the district refused to provide interpreters, and Orlando organized a space where parents could share without fear. I watching parents use an interpreter for the first time and say what they needed to say without translating under stress. One mother said through an interpreter, "I thought school was not for people like me," and the room went quiet because no one should have to say that. At home, my abuela recovered slowly and she kept telling me to be honest at the hearing. "Tell them the truth," she said, fingers wrapped around mine, and I could hear her faith as clearly as her voice. She knew what it meant to be minimized by a system that expected people to fit a mold. My mom stayed at work and kept a careful schedule, and we labeled bottles and left notes for neighbors. Those changes were small, practical, and they meant I could sleep better when I wasn't at school. The scholarship committee deferred their decision while they reviewed my record, which felt like a slow orbit of worry that didn't stop. I lost some opportunities because of the suspension and because people judged a few seconds of video. Colleges and committees asked for explanations, and I had to write the same story over and over like a petition. It cost me time and quiet. But the binder I had made with classmates and the op-ed changed the conversation at school. The district had to start an inquiry and accept interpreter requests. Teachers who had policed hallways began to think twice when a parent asked for help in another language. The fight didn't end with a memo or an exception. The rule still existed in spirit, and the culture of silence didn't vanish overnight. But I stopped hiding my voice. I started answering calls honesty when it mattered and speaking up when rules tried to erase a whole part of who we were. It felt dangerous at times and it cost me, but it also made room for other people to say their truth. That change was messy, small, and real. I kept pushing because the next kid shouldn't have to choose between a rule and a life, and because my abuela's hand in mine taught me that some things are worth the cost. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.